the denial in the sky. The cabin lights were dim and soft as the aircraft hummed steadily across the sky, carrying hundreds of passengers who were tired, restless, or quietly whispering to each other. The air smelled faintly of reheated meals, and the sound of engines blended with the low murmur of human voices. In the middle row sat a mother and her twin girls, no older than 10, dressed neatly with their small backpacks tucked under the seats. Their faces glowed with innocence, their braids shining as they leaned against each other, one whispering a secret that made the other giggle softly. Their mother watched them with quiet pride, holding their small hands every now and then to reassure them that the long journey would soon be over. It was then that one of the twins shifted uncomfortably, glancing at her sister, and then at her mother. The mother leaned close, and the child whispered timidly that she needed to use the restroom. The mother nodded gently and encouraged her to stand up. The other twin followed suit, shyly admitting that she too needed to go. Together they walked carefully down the narrow aisle, holding hands. Their mother followed a step behind, guiding them toward the back of the plane, where the restroom doors stood with glowing red and green signs. The girls reached the door and tapped lightly on it, but found it locked. They waited nervously until a passenger emerged, and they began to step forward just as a flight attendant in a crisp uniform appeared, blocking their path with a stern look. She towered over the small girls, her eyes sharp and her lips pressed tight. She crossed her arms and shook her head firmly. "No, not now," she said in a cold voice, startling both children. The girls froze, their small hands clutching each other tightly. Their mother blinked in confusion and asked politely if her daughters could use the restroom. The attendant's face hardened even more. She said the restroom was off limits at the moment, and the girls would have to return to their seats. Her tone was sharp, dismissive, and loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. The twins lowered their heads, their cheeks flushed with embarrassment, as though they had done something wrong. Their mother felt her chest tighten with disbelief and anger, but she held her composure as she asked again, reminding the attendant that the children were very young and could not wait long. The attendant gave a cold smile and repeated her refusal. She claimed there were procedures being carried out and that children were not an exception. Her voice carried through the cabin, drawing the attention of several passengers who now turned their heads, watching silently. Some frowned, others shook their heads, yet no one spoke. The mother's voice wavered with controlled fury as she explained that the girls had been patient and respectful and deserved basic dignity, but the attendant only raised her chin in arrogance and waved them away like they were an inconvenience. Twins looked up at their mother, their eyes glistening with tears and confusion. They did not understand why they were being denied something so simple, something so necessary. Their small frames trembled as they clung closer to their mother, who pulled them gently toward her chest. She could feel their heartbeats racing, and it fueled her own rising fire. The humiliation was not just against her daughters, but against their very humanity, and the silence of the surrounding passengers made the air feel heavy and cruel. The mother guided her girls back to their seats, every step filled with tension. Her jaw tightened as she comforted them, whispering promises that they would be okay. The girls nodded, but their tears betrayed the deep wound of shame that had been forced upon them. She sat down with them, but her eyes never left the aisle. She watched as the attendant strutted away as if she had won a battle, completely unaware that the war had only just begun. As the flight continued, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted. Passengers whispered behind hands, exchanging glances filled with unease. Some were angry, but hesitant to speak. Others avoided eye contact, pretending nothing had happened, but the moment had already planted seeds of outrage. The mother noticed every glance, every flicker of sympathy, and every trace of cowardice. She sat still, her hand gripping the twins tightly, and her eyes fixed on the window. Though her mind burned with thoughts her daughters deserved more than this silence, and she would not let the humiliation vanish into the sky. Unnoticed, the girls leaned against her shoulders, slowly drifting into restless sleep, but their breaths were uneven, and their small bodies twitched with discomfort. The mother stroked their hair, soothing them, while her heart raged quietly. She replayed the scene again and again, the cold refusal, the cruel dismissal, the stunned silence around her. She knew deep within that this was not an isolated act of arrogance. It was a reflection of something larger, something uglier, and she would not allow it to be buried in shadows. The hum of the engines filled her ears, but beneath that sound, she could hear her own heartbeat, steady and determined. The flight was far from over, and so was this fight. She glanced once more at the attendant, who now poured drinks for other passengers, smiling politely as if nothing had happened. The sight ignited a vow within the mother's spirit. She would carry this injustice down to the ground, and she would not rest until those who had tried to strip her daughters of dignity were forced to face the world. The sky outside was endless and dark, but within the heart of the mother a storm was forming, silent and unstoppable. She kissed the foreheads of her sleeping girls and whispered to herself a promise that no one else could hear. This was not the end, it was the beginning of something greater. She knew that by the time this plane touched the earth, the truth would not stay hidden, and her daughters would never again feel that their voices did not matter. Night stretched on with quiet tension, but the mother sat still, unyielding. A passenger across the aisle gave her a small nod, as if acknowledging her strength. Another handed her a tissue silently, offering support. She accepted it with a soft smile, but said nothing. For now, silence was her shield, but deep inside her, silence was sharpening into a weapon that would soon be unleashed. The twins stirred again. In their sleep, pressing closer to her, the mother held them tighter, her mind replaying every second of the denial, not with despair, but with fuel. She would turn this pain into power. She would show her daughters that their worth could never be decided by someone in uniform with a hardened heart. The denial in the sky had lit a fire that would soon descend to the ground, where the world would see it burn bright. A mother's rising fire. The cabin lights brightened slightly as the crew moved about, serving drinks and snacks, but the mother barely noticed, her focus locked on her daughters, whose tired eyes still showed traces of hurt. She brushed their braids with her hand, whispering comfort, yet beneath her soft words, her spirit burned hotter. With every passing minute she had seen injustice before, but never so directly aimed at the innocence of her children, and the taste of it was bitter and unshakable. The humiliation clung to the air around her, reminding her again and again that silence had been the shield of the cruel. She watched the attendant who had denied her girls, now moving between rows, smiling with artificial warmth to passengers who accepted their drinks with polite nods. That smile cut into her like a knife. How could someone show such open cruelty to children, then turn around and perform sweetness as though nothing had happened? The contrast made the mother's chest rise with controlled fury. She was not the kind of woman who raised her voice without reason, but when her children were made to suffer, the boundaries of patience dissolved into something else entirely. Her daughters shifted in their seats, one tugging softly at her sleeve, asking if they had done something wrong. The mother leaned close and assured them in a steady voice that they had done nothing wrong, that sometimes people who hold power forget compassion and use their position to make others feel small. The girls listened, their wide eyes searching for comfort, and she gave it to them with every ounce of strength she had, but inside her rage only deepened. Her daughters should never have to carry the weight of someone else's cruelty on their shoulders. Passengers continued to whisper, some dared to glance at her, their eyes showing sympathy. Others avoided her gaze, unwilling to step into conflict. The mother noticed everything. She noticed the businessman across the aisle, shifting uncomfortably, the young woman near the window, holding her phone tightly as if she wanted to record but lacked courage. She noticed the silence of people who should have spoken, and the quiet nods of a few who silently agreed. With her outrage, the cabin felt like a theater of masks, where everyone played their role, some as witnesses, some as cowards, and some as silent allies. The mother sat still, her hands folded over her lap, but her thoughts were a raging storm. She thought about how her daughters would remember this moment. Would they remember the cruelty or the strength of their mother? Would they carry shame, or would they carry pride? She refused to let their memory be scarred by humiliation. She would rise, she would fight, and she would show them that dignity can never be taken without a battle. She leaned close to them again and whispered softly that when they landed she would make sure their voices were heard. The girls nodded with small smiles, their trust in her unshaken, and that trust fueled her even more. The attendant passed by again, and the mother raised her hand firmly, stopping her. The woman turned with impatience, her smile fading when she recognized who had called her. The mother asked, again calmly but with fire beneath her words, why her daughters had been denied such a basic human need. The attendant stiffened her jaw and responded with the same arrogance, claiming that procedures had to be followed and no exceptions could be made. The mother's voice sharpened. She asked what procedures could possibly justify humiliating to small children in front of an entire plane. The attendant faltered for just a moment, then muttered something vague about safety and moved on. Dismissal was like fuel poured on flames. The mother sat back, but her heart thundered louder than the engines. She could feel her daughters trembling again, but this time she wrapped her arms around them and whispered, that they had nothing to fear because their mother would not let this stand. She had faced hardships in her life before, but never had she felt the fire burn so purely for justice. Her daughters were her world, and this insult had carved itself deep into her soul. As the hours passed, the tension did not fade. It grew thicker as passengers replayed the scene in their own minds. Some leaned closer to each other, muttering their disgust at what had happened. A few began to glance at the mother with admiration, silently cheering her strength, though she had yet to unleash it. A man near the back whispered that he had captured the moment on his phone, but he hesitated, unsure if he should share it. The mother noticed the hesitation in the people around her, and she understood it. Fear of standing out, fear of conflict, fear of drawing attention to oneself, but she also knew fear was the reason injustice survived. She thought of her own childhood when she had been told to sit quietly to avoid trouble, when she had been taught that speaking out could bring consequences, yet she had also learned that silence only let cruelty multiply. Now, with her daughters by her side, she knew she could not choose silence ever again. If she remained quiet now, she would be teaching them to accept humiliation as part of life, and that was a lesson she would never allow them to carry. Her eyes locked on the attendant once more, and she made a silent vow that this humiliation would not end here. She would not scream in rage, because rage could be dismissed as hysteria. She would not beg for kindness, because kindness denied once was rarely granted. Again, she would instead hold her strength until the moment was right, and then she would strike with truth that could not be ignored. She thought of the ground waiting below, of the airport filled with people, of the voices that could amplify hers, and she began to plan her stand. Her daughters leaned against her, drifting into uneasy rest, their trust placed entirely in the arms that held them. The mother gazed down at them, her heart swelling with love that merged seamlessly into fury. She kissed their foreheads softly and promised again that justice would come. The cabin felt like a cage, but her spirit was unbroken. She felt the heat of her anger shaping into clarity. She would confront, she would speak, she would not allow their tears to be wasted. Their plane continued its path through the sky, a fragile world suspended between clouds and stars, but within that world a storm of resolve was brewing, stronger than the turbulence of the winds outside. The mother sat in silence, but her silence was heavy, filled with weight that the crew could not see. Yet her fire had risen past the point of return. It was no longer a question of whether she would act, but when and how. By the time the seatbelt signs lit again and the captain's voice echoed across the cabin, preparing passengers for landing, the mother's plan had already formed in her mind. She would not let her daughters walk off this plane carrying only shame. They would walk off carrying the truth, spoken loudly enough for the world to hear. She would be their shield and their voice. She would be the storm that no uniformed arrogance could silence. The fire inside her no longer wavered. It had become a rising sun, promising that when the plane touched the ground, the world would feel its heat. Tension among the clouds, the cabin seemed quieter than before, yet beneath the stillness there was an unease that touched nearly every passenger. The hum of the engines was steady, the lights glowed faintly above rows of faces, and yet the silence carried weight. Everyone had witnessed what had happened, and though most tried to return to their books, their screens, their meals, the image of two small girls being turned away lingered in their minds. The twin sisters sat pressed close against their mother, their heads resting on her arms, their breaths shallow, as though the humiliation had seeped into their dreams. The mother sat straight, her face calm, yet her eyes burning with something unspoken. She was aware of the shifting eyes, the whispers, the occasional sigh of disbelief from strangers. She could feel the tension like a string stretched too tightly across the cabin, waiting to snap. The crew walked up and down with rehearsed smiles, but even they seemed uneasy, their glances flicking briefly toward her, as if they knew the situation had already traveled beyond their control. The mother's fire had grown, but she let it stay hidden for the moment. She knew the time for words was not yet, and silence could sometimes speak louder than protest. She allowed her daughters to rest against her shoulders, knowing their trust was her greatest weapon. She thought about the future, about what they would remember from this flight, and she promised herself that their memory would not end in shame, it would end in power. The twin girls stirred awake when the trolley rolled by, their eyes sleepy but filled with the quiet sadness of children who had been treated unfairly. One of them whispered, asking if they could try again to go to the restroom, and the mother's chest tightened. She pulled her daughters close and whispered that they would wait until the plane landed, that she would make sure no one could deny them again. The girls nodded, though disappointment still touched their small faces, and the mother felt the wound deepen further inside her around them. Passengers shifted, some exchanged glances with her, a few nodding silently, as though to say they supported her. Others quickly looked away, uncomfortable in the presence of conflict. Some pulled out phones, pretending to check messages, but really capturing images or writing quick notes about what had happened. The mother saw all of it and understood that this moment had already become more than just her fight. The story was spreading already, with whispers and recordings, and soon it would grow wings wider. Then this plane, the attendant who had denied her daughters, appeared again, her shoes clicking against the floor, her posture proud as though she had done nothing wrong. She passed their row without looking at them, but the mother watched her every step. The arrogance was unshaken, yet the mother could sense a flicker of unease beneath the woman's stiff composure. The storm brewing in the cabin was not invisible, and the attendant surely felt its chill. She might ignore it now, but the reckoning was already waiting at the ground. Below, the air grew heavier as the plane cut through pockets of turbulence, making passengers grip their armrests. The girls pressed even closer to their mother, frightened by the sudden shudders. She kissed their foreheads, whispering calm into their ears, telling them to imagine the sky as a cradle, rocking them gently. Though her own heart was not calm, her heart was pounding with purpose. She looked out the window at the clouds shifting and swirling, and thought how they mirrored her own storm. The businessman across the aisle leaned closer, at one point his voice low, as he told the mother that he had seen everything and he thought it was unacceptable. He offered to speak on her behalf when they landed. The mother nodded with gratitude, but told him softly that she had her own voice, and she would use it. He smiled slightly, respecting her strength, and leaned back into his seat. The exchange was small, but it added fuel to her determination, knowing that witnesses were ready to step forward. Another passenger, a young woman near the back, tapped her phone nervously. She had recorded the confrontation earlier, and she whispered to a neighbor that she planned to post it online once they landed. The neighbor encouraged her, saying people deserved to know what had happened. The mother overheard this and felt a sense of vindication forming. The truth was not only in her hands now, it was multiplying, carried by others who had the courage to share it with the world. The minutes stretched long as the plane continued its journey. Every small sound seemed louder than before: the rustle of magazines, the clink of cups, the faint cough of a passenger. The mother felt her daughter's warmth against her arms, and every beat of their hearts made her resolve harder. She thought of all the times she had told them to stand tall, to never let anyone treat them as less than human, and she knew this moment was a test, not just for her, but for the lessons she had taught. She could not fail them. As the captain's voice eventually announced the beginning of descent, a murmur ran through the cabin. People straightened their seats, buckled their belts, and prepared for landing. Yet beneath these ordinary emotions, the tension did not fade. It grew thicker. The mother's eyes sharpened. She knew that time was drawing near. She would not scream or cause chaos inside the cabin, but the second those doors opened, she would rise. She would not walk quietly into the terminal carrying humiliation like luggage. She would unleash the truth in front of witnesses, and she would not be silenced. Her daughters asked quietly if they would be home soon. She kissed them again, promising that once they stepped off this plane, they would be free. But she added in her own heart that freedom meant more than leaving the cabin. Freedom meant stripping away the cruelty that had dared to touch her children. The girls rested their heads again, smiling faintly as they trusted her words and her strength. The descent rattled the cabin with shudders as clouds passed quickly outside. The mother sat unmoved, her gaze steady, her arms wrapped around her daughters. Her silence was not weakness, it was preparation. The passengers around her could feel it, the quiet power that radiated from her seat and spread through the row. The attendant glanced her way once and quickly looked away, sensing the unspoken storm growing ever closer. When the wheels finally struck the runway with a heavy thud, the mother closed her eyes for a brief moment, not in relief, but in readiness. The time of waiting was over. The humiliation endured in silence was about to be transformed into a voice so powerful it would echo far beyond this cabin. She opened her eyes again, steady as stone, and kissed the tops of her daughters' heads, whispering words they would never forget. They had been denied in the sky, but on the ground they would rise together, and the world would listen. The plane slowed, rolling across the runway. Toward the gate, passengers fidgeted, unbuckling early, whispering about connections and luggage. Yet the mother did not move. Her fire remained still, waiting until the exact moment when the world would see what strength truly looked like. She was not simply a mother anymore, she was a storm waiting for release. The clouds outside parted slightly, letting sunlight spill through the window, and it touched her face like a quiet omen of what was to come. She tightened her arms around her daughters, her eyes unyielding and her spirit unbreakable. The landing and the stand. The plane rolled slowly toward the gate, its wheels grinding against the pavement as the engine softened to a low growl. The passengers began to stir, unbuckling belts despite warnings, gathering their bags and stretching cramped limbs. The smell of reheated food and recycled air lingered, but something else heavier hung above the cabin, a sense of waiting, a sense of expectation, as though everyone knew that what had been simmering in silence through the long flight was about to erupt into something greater. The twins pressed closer to her, their mother holding her hands, their small eyes tired but full of trust. The mother looked at them, her lips softening into a smile. Though her heart burned with determination, she could still see the hurt in their faces, the confusion of children who had been treated as though their needs were unworthy. That sight alone was enough to fuel the fire that surged through her veins. She would not let them carry this pain without seeing that dignity could be defended. The seatbelt sign went off, and the familiar sound of passengers springing to their feet filled the cabin. Bags dropped from overhead compartments, coats were pulled down, voices rose in hurried chatter about connecting flights and luggage. The mother remained seated for a moment, holding her daughters close. Her stillness was in sharp contrast to the flurry around her, like the calm before a storm. The twins looked at her, waiting for her lead, and she whispered softly that it was time. They rose together, moving slowly into the aisle. A few passengers stepped aside, letting them pass with quiet respect. The mother's eyes never left the front of the plane, where the attendants waited stiff and rehearsed their plastic smiles, already in place for the goodbye ritual. But those smiles faltered when they saw her approaching. She carried herself with unshakable steadiness, her daughters at her sides like living proof of the wrong that had been done. Her silence pressed against them, heavier than any words. The first attendant offered a hollow smile and a forced thank you for flying with us, but the mother's gaze cut straight through it. She did not nod, she did not smile. Instead, she spoke clearly, her voice carrying down the aisle so every ear could hear. She recounted what had happened, how her daughters had been humiliated, denied basic human dignity, in front of an entire cabin of witnesses. Her words were calm, yet they struck like thunder, filling the confined space with a weight that could not be ignored. Passengers froze in the aisle, their chatter silenced. Phones were raised again, catching every word. The twins clutched their mother's hands, their eyes wide but their backs straight, as though they could feel her strength pouring into them. The attendants stiffened, their smiles vanished, replaced by unease. One stammered something about misunderstanding, another tried to speak of procedures, but the mother's voice rose over them, steady, strong, unwavering. She told them no procedure, no policy, no excuse could justify shaming to small children for needing what every human being deserves. Her words broke the silence of others. A man near the back called out that he had seen everything. A woman near the window added that she had filmed it. Passengers began to murmur, not in whispers now, but in voices that carried support. Some shook their heads at the attendants, some nodded firmly at the mother, their voices layered together until the cabin became a chorus of agreement, a storm of truth rising. Higher and higher, the attendants faltered their authority, unraveling in the face of collective outrage. The mother stepped closer to them, her daughters holding on tightly. She demanded to speak with someone in charge, someone beyond the hollow smiles of attendants who had caused pain. She told them clearly that this would not end at the door of the aircraft, that truth would follow them into the airport, into the eyes of the world. Watching beyond, she stood tall, her voice unwavering, and her daughters looked up at her with awe, for they saw not only their mother but a warrior who refused to bow. The doors of the plane opened and sunlight spilled into the cabin, flooding it with brightness. The mother led her daughters down the narrow tunnel, her steps strong, every movement echoing with purpose. Passengers followed behind, some whispering, some still recording. The hum of the airport grew louder, and with it the stage widened from a cabin of witnesses to a terminal filled with strangers who would soon become audience to what was about to unfold. At the gate, uniformed staff waited, their faces polite but stiff. The attendants had already whispered hurriedly to them, trying to control the story before it reached the ground. Yet when the mother stepped forward, her presence was undeniable. Her daughters at her sides, her voice clear and steady, she began to recount again what had taken place. She told them of the humiliation of her children, of the arrogance she had faced, of the tears that had been forced from her daughter's eyes. She spoke not with rage but with conviction, her words shaped not by anger alone but by the unbreakable love of a mother protecting her own. The staff attempted their polished responses, words like "We are sorry for the inconvenience and we will look into it," but the mother's eyes sharpened, her voice cut through. Their rehearsed phrases demanding truth, demanding accountability. Passengers gathered around, lending their voices one by one. Witnesses raised their phones, showing videos, their screens glowing proof of cruelty that could not be denied. The chorus of voices grew louder, filling the terminal, drawing the attention of strangers who stopped mid-stride to listen. The twins stood pressed close against their mother, watching her with wonder. They could see her strength in every word, her refusal to bend, her refusal to let their pain be swept away. She was teaching them in real time that silence is not the answer, that dignity is worth standing for. They held her hands tighter, as if drawing courage from her flame. The staff faltered under the rising storm. They called for supervisors. They whispered urgently into radios, but nothing they could do could erase the truth that was now spilling into the air, carried by dozens of voices and cameras. The mother's stand had already begun to ripple beyond control. The arrogance that had dismissed her daughters in the sky was now unraveling under the weight of justice on the ground. Her voice did not waver once she demanded answers. She demanded that those responsible be held accountable, and she made it clear that this was not just about her family. It was about every passenger who had watched in silence, every child who had ever been humiliated, every person who had been told they did not matter. She transformed her daughters' tears into a call for dignity that rang across the terminal until even those who had not been on the flight stood listening, their faces solemn, their hearts stirred. The twins lifted their heads higher, no longer just children who had been denied, but children who had witnessed their mother's power. They saw that strength did not come from silence, it came from standing tall, even when the world wanted you to bow. They saw that humiliation could be turned into something greater, something that could change not only their lives but the lives of others. The attendants who had once smiled with arrogance now stood cornered, their composure cracked, their faces revealed discomfort, their bodies stiff with unease. The storm they had dismissed in the sky had become a force they could not contain on the ground, and at the center of it stood the mother, unyielding, her daughters by her side, her voice carrying like thunder across the wide terminal. She had made her stand, and the world was listening. The public outcry, the mother's voice still echoed through the terminal. Long after she paused, her words had broken the silence that so many were afraid to shatter, and now the weight of her stand was spilling far beyond the gate. The passengers who had witnessed the cruelty firsthand stepped forward with their phones held high, showing videos of the moment. The twins had been denied recordings that captured the arrogance of the attendant, and the tears of the children's screens glowed like lanterns in the crowd as people replayed the scene in disbelief and passed it on to others who gathered to watch. It began with murmurs, small gasps from strangers who had no connection to the flight. Then the murmurs grew into louder voices of shock and anger. Strangers who had not been present now pointed at the screens and shook their heads, their faces hardened by outrage. Someone exclaimed that this was unacceptable in any circumstance, and another called out that children deserved protection, not humiliation. The sound rose layer upon layer until the terminal buzzed with a collective storm of disapproval. Airline staff tried to calm the crowd, their voices rehearsed, their faces polished, yet their words fell like stones into a river swept away instantly by the current of truth. Videos were already leaving the terminal, uploaded in real time, spreading through the endless channels of social media. Within minutes, they were shared by passengers to family, friends, and then to strangers who passed it further until the story became unstoppable. It spread across platforms, gathering speed like fire catching dry grass. The mother stood silently with her daughters pressed against her sides. She no longer needed to speak, for the moment had grown beyond her. Her truth was now carried by hundreds of voices, thousands of shares, and countless eyes watching. Across the world, the twins looked up at her, their small hands holding tightly to hers. They no longer looked confused or afraid. Their faces glowed with awe as they realized the power of their mother's courage. The terminal vibrated with sound as people argued with airline staff, demanding answers, demanding justice, demanding accountability. Some called for supervisors, others shouted for apologies. The attendants who had once held power in the cabin now looked cornered, their faces pale, Their confidence broken, the weight of cameras recording their every move left them stripped of the arrogance they had once worn. Like armor, they tried to retreat into back rooms, tried to escape the growing storm, but the crowd followed with eyes that refused to turn away. Outside the terminal, the story exploded. News alerts lit up phones. Journalists scrambled to confirm details. Hashtags began to form, carrying the story into trending spaces across the country and beyond. People who had never stepped onto that flight now spoke as though they had been there. Fueled by the raw clarity of the video evidence, they saw the twins being denied. They heard the dismissive tone of the attendant, and they felt the injustice deep within themselves. The story became not just about two children on one flight, but about the broader wound of how dignity could be denied, and how silence had allowed it to grow on. Rector Mother stood still, watching the unfolding storm. She held her daughters close, whispering soft comfort into their ears. She told them not to be afraid of the noise, not to be afraid of the crowd, not to be afraid of the anger, for all of it was rising in their defense. She told them they were safe in her arms, and that the world was learning the truth step by step. The girls nodded, their eyes wide with wonder as they realized they were no longer just children caught in humiliation. They had become the heart of something far bigger. News crews arrived, drawn by the tidal wave of attention. Cameras flashed, microphones appeared, reporters pressed forward, shouting questions. Yet the mother did not rush to speak. She waited until her daughters were comfortable, until she could feel their small shoulders steady. Then she faced the cameras and spoke with calm, unwavering clarity. She told the story again, but this time to the world. She described the refusal, the humiliation, the tears, and she described how silence in the cabin had weighed heavier than the denial itself. She spoke not with rage, but with the authority of truth and love. Her words reached millions through the screens of televisions and phones, carrying with them the undeniable power of a mother's voice. The public response was immediate. Voices rose across cities, towns, and neighborhoods. People posted their anger, their heartbreak, their solidarity. Some shared their own stories of being silenced or dismissed. Some demanded boycotts, some called for resignations, some offered messages of love and strength. To the twins, the hashtags grew louder, climbing into trending spaces where thousands upon thousands added their voices. The story had become a mirror, reflecting not just one injustice but the weight of many others. Like Airline issued a statement, quickly polished with careful words, calling the incident a misunderstanding, promising to investigate. Yet the public was not satisfied. The video evidence was to clear the tears, to roar the mother's voice, too powerful for polished words to erase. The statement only fueled further outrage as people demanded more than empty promises. They wanted accountability, they wanted action, they wanted change. The pressure grew heavier with every hour, until the airline's name became a symbol of cruelty. Across headlines and feeds through it all, the mother held her daughters steady. She shielded them from the harshest lights of cameras. She whispered reminders that they were brave, that they were loved, that none of this storm was their fault. They nestled close to her, their trust unbroken, their eyes wide as they realized their tears had been transformed into something unshakable. Their mother had turned their pain into a fire that now burned in the hearts of millions. Crowds outside the airport began to chant, demanding justice for the twins. People held signs with their names, with words of support, with calls for change. The sound echoed into the night, carrying the energy of thousands who refused to let this moment pass quietly. The attendants who had denied the girls were now hidden away, their faces printed across screens, their names dragged into the open. Their arrogance had collapsed into shame under the weight of public fury. The mother stood strong at the center of it all, not seeking fame, not seeking glory, only determined that the voices of her daughters would never again be silenced. She was proof that one person, standing firm, could ignite a fire that no corporation, no polished statement, no silence could extinguish. She was proof that truth once spoken cannot be buried again. The public had heard her, and they had risen with her, transforming one moment of cruelty into a moment of outrage and solidarity. As the story spread further across the globe, she knew this was no longer just her battle. It had become the battle of everyone who had ever been silenced, of every child who had been dismissed, of every voice that had been told to wait and be quiet. The fire that had started in the cabin of one plane was now lighting the world, and it showed no signs of fading. The twins looked up at their mother, their eyes bright, no longer with tears, but with pride. They saw in her the strength they would one day carry. Themselves they understood that dignity must be defended, that silence must be broken, that love can become a shield stronger than any wall. They had lived through humiliation, but now they were living through transformation. The public outcry had turned their pain into power, and they would never forget the lesson it carved into their hearts: justice and closure. Noise of the crowd outside the airport echoed into the night chants, filling the air with calls for justice and truth. The mother stood with her daughters, their small hands wrapped tightly around hers, while cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions, but she kept her calm, steady voice firm and her heart unshaken. She had carried her daughters from humiliation in the sky to power on the ground, and now the world had taken hold of their story. The weight of silence had been broken, and the voices of strangers now rose in defense of two small children who had been denied their dignity. The videos spread faster than anyone could contain. Millions watched the moment of refusal, the tears of the twins, the unyielding strength of the mother who would not be silenced. Hashtags soared through platforms, uniting voices across continents. People who had never met the family felt the wound as their own and demanded answers. The airline that once held power now found itself drowning under the weight of outrage, their polished statements unable to stop the tide of fury that swept over them. Within days, the airline's leadership appeared before cameras, their faces drawn with tension. They apologized publicly, their words heavy with the recognition that no excuse could mend what had been broken. They promised accountability. They promised changes in training. They promised that no child, no passenger, would ever again endure what those twins had endured. The attendants involved were suspended, their arrogance stripped away by the glare of public judgment. And though the mother listened to their apologies, she knew this moment was not about individuals alone, but about the system that allowed such cruelty to live in silence. The mother did not accept their apology as an ending. She told them clearly that words meant nothing without action. She demanded to see proof of change. She demanded transparency. She demanded that policies be rewritten, not just polished for appearance, but reshaped with humanity at the core. She spoke again. For the cameras, for the millions who listened, not with rage, but with conviction. She told them her daughters deserved better, that every child deserved better, that no parent should have to watch their children cry because basic dignity had been denied. Her voice traveled again like fire through the world. People praised her strength, calling her a warrior mother, calling her a voice for those too afraid to speak. She did not seek the praise, but she understood its purpose. She understood that her stand had grown into something larger than herself, and that it now belonged to the hearts of others who carried her story as their own. The twins held on to her through it all, their eyes wide with wonder as they watched the world shift around them. They saw their faces on screens. They heard their names chanted by strangers. They felt the warmth of support from people they would never meet, and most of all, they saw their mother standing unbreakable at the center of the storm. They had once been humiliated in silence, but now they were lifted by a chorus of millions who refused to let them feel small. Again, as weeks passed, the airline rolled out new policies. They trained staff in compassion. They created rules that placed humanity above procedure. They held sessions that forced attendants to understand the weight of their power and the damage of their arrogance. They sent letters of apology to the mother and her daughters, but more importantly, they changed actions that would ripple into the future. And though the mother knew nothing could erase the memory of that day, she also knew the pain had been transformed into progress. She walked with her daughters into community gatherings where people thanked her for her strength, where parents told her they now felt braver to speak, where children looked at her with admiration. She told them all the same message: that silence protects the cruel, but truth defends the innocent, that every voice matters, that no humiliation should ever go unanswered. Her daughters listened to every word, their eyes bright with pride, knowing that their tears had helped carve this truth into the world. At night, when the world was quieter, the mother would hold her twins close, whispering softly that they had been brave, that their pain had meaning, that they had turned suffering into strength. The girls would smile, their eyes heavy with sleep, and they would whisper back that they were proud of her. That simple exchange healed wounds deeper than any apology could ever reach them. Story eventually drifted from headlines, as all stories do, but its echo did not fade. The policies remained, the lesson remained, the strength of a mother's stand remained etched into the memory of those who had witnessed it. The twins grew with the proud knowledge that they had seen injustice, and seen it defeated, not by violence but by truth, not by silence but by courage. They grew with the certainty that their worth was unshakable, and their dignity untouchable. The mother knew that this was victory, not only for her daughters, but for every silent voice that found strength in her. stand, she had turned humiliation into transformation. She had turned arrogance into accountability. She had turned silence into a storm that had shaken a corporation to its knees, and she had shown her daughters that dignity once defended becomes a legacy that no one can take away. As she walked with them one evening beneath a sky streaked with fading light, she held their hands and told them once more that they were never small, that their voices mattered, that they were born to stand tall. The twins squeezed her hands back, their eyes bright with pride and love, and in that moment she felt the storm settle into peace. She had fought, she had endured, she had won, not for herself alone, but for them, for the world, for truth. The denial in the sky had tried to strip them of dignity, but on the ground they had risen higher than clouds. Their story would live on, not as a tale of humiliation, but as a tale of triumph, of love, of fire that refused to be silenced. The end.